Hello, humans. I just finished reading a book called Living Yogacara by Tagawa Shune, and I thought I'd give you my little review of it. The book came out in 2009, but was originally written, when was it? In the 80s sometime. 1989, in Japanese. And it is an attempt to explain in as short a form as possible a philosophy in Buddhism called Yogacara. Yogacara has often been labeled radical Buddhist idealism. I'm not absolutely certain of this, but I'm pretty sure the first time I came across a reference to Yogacara was when I was in high school, and I used to read a lot of books by Philip K. Dick, the science fiction author. There's a bunch of his, they're hidden behind the Welcome Back, Kotter things, but there's a bunch of his books over here. Used to really like Philip K. Dick. I still do when I read him. And he mentioned this radical Buddhist idealism concept. Well, whether or not Yogacara can be considered idealism is a debate among Western philosophers who have studied the philosophy. I should clarify, though, that when I say idealism, I'm talking about idealism in the philosophical sense. There's a tendency for people these days to use the word idealism as a synonym for optimism or being positive and happy. And that's what I thought of it when I first started hearing that word, and I thought, what do they mean? What's wrong with being happy? It sounds good. No, idealism is a philosophical stance, a Western philosophical stance, that takes as its axiom, I'm not even sure if I'm using the word axiom correctly here, that what is real is only consciousness. Now, this idea of consciousness is interesting in terms of Yogacara, in terms of Buddhism in general. In the West, we've developed this idea that there is a thing called consciousness that we experience, and people debate over whether consciousness is reality, like is consciousness creating reality, or is it the ultimate substratum of reality, or is consciousness just a byproduct of material processes and so forth? And there's been debate about this forever. The Buddhist idea is a bit different. One of the ways this sort of was explained to me in very short form by my teacher, Nishijima Roshi, was one day when he said, "Consciousness is just an idea." And I would be going, which, if you actually get into it, seems to be true. We have an idea of consciousness. We have an idea of watermelons, and we have an idea of grapes, and an idea of pomegranates. I don't know why I'm going with fruit here, but things in the world we have an idea about, and the things themselves are actually different from the ideas. You can't eat the concept of pomegranate, but you can eat a pomegranate. You use language to describe something, but that thing that you're describing doesn't always fit right with the language that you're using to describe it. Same with consciousness. There is something that we provisionally call consciousness, but is it this thing we think it is? I won't say I understand Yogacara Buddhism after reading just one book about the subject, and I've got a couple others I want to read because it's interesting, but I'll tell you what I know from reading this book. Yogacara is a philosophy that predates Zen. It probably developed in India a few hundred years after Buddha's death. And what strikes most Western readers when they first encounter Yogacara is it sounds a lot like psychology. It doesn't really even sound like a religion anymore. It sounds like a kind of strange Asian sort of ancient psychology. The Yogacara philosophers came up with an idea called alaya vijnana that in many ways maps very closely onto the Western idea of the subconscious. Only it appeared in Buddhism hundreds of years before Freud and his friends came up with the idea of the unconscious. They have this idea of alaya vijnana, which is the storehouse consciousness, which they came up with to explain how we can seem to have a store of knowledge or a store of experience that we are not consciously aware of. The Yogacara philosophers noticed this, and they wanted to try to get an idea of it. So one of the things Yogacara did was divide the mind, which we have to be careful with this idea of mind, but we'll just go on it for now, into 8 8 parts. And they call these 8 consciousnesses. So seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching are not considered by Yogacara to be senses that feed into consciousness which exists somewhere apart from them, but they are considered to be consciousnesses. So seeing is a consciousness, hearing is a consciousness, smelling and tasting, so forth. And then they, in order to make sense of what happens in this realm of consciousness, if we want to use that word, they knew they needed to add 3 more to that. Now the 6th one often appears in Buddhism. They often talk about 6 senses. And the 6th sense isn't the Bruce Willis movie Sixth Sense of clairvoyance and, whatever, I don't know what the other ones are. Mind over matter and blah, blah. It's the mind, what we in the West think of as the mind, as another sense or another consciousness. So the mind senses the input of the other consciousnesses and assembles it into something, and also senses the other 2 consciousnesses and integrates them. The other 2 are alaya vijnana, which is similar to the idea of the subconscious. It stores all of your experiences and memories and thoughts somewhere as seeds, they call them, which are perfumed by experience. It gets very weird. And the other consciousness is called manas, and manas is kind of the idea of self. It sits in there between the alaya vijnana and the other 6 senses, and creates this idea of self that it believes all of these senses are part of. But it's a mistake, according to Buddhism, which has this idea of self being a kind of delusion. Yogacara philosophy gets super complicated, and the book does its best to simplify it, but it gets, even reading this book, which is a simplified version, was kind of a mind stretcher for me, because I'm going, what? There's this idea of 51 somethings, which I can't even get into, and I just finished the book yesterday, that exist under these 8 consciousnesses, and I couldn't follow it. The Yogacara philosophy has been extremely influential in Zen, but is a bit different from Zen philosophy. It takes this idea that knowledge, gnosis in the Western sense, is what's going to set you free in quotes. But the thing that's going to fix your problems, or get you on the way to fixing your problems at the very least, is knowledge of what those problems are. And the Zen people tend to be a little skeptical about that. They see the value in having knowledge about things, and that's certainly emphasized in the Zen sect, is that it's good to have knowledge about things. But the Zen sect also takes the point of view that it's not necessary, that knowing, like having a nice intellectual framework for what's going on in your life isn't going to fix anything, really. It might be helpful, it might be useful, but it doesn't lead to any sort of salvation or freeing. It's a way of understanding things, but it doesn't fix anything. Yogacara tends to take the idea that this knowledge is, it's hard to say. I was going to say sufficient to bring about liberation, but I don't get the impression that they think that. But they think it's not sufficient, but I think they believe it's a necessary step to take in the direction if you want to kind of figure out life and get free of your own delusions. You have to understand them. The Zen Buddhists don't think you necessarily have to understand all of this stuff intellectually. You just practice with it until such time as you break through it, if we want to go that way. Anyway, real interesting book. I recommend it for anybody who is serious about studying this sort of form of Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy and wants a kind of deeper understanding of the philosophical underpinnings of Buddhism. And I don't recommend it for casual readers who just want something kind of light and fluffy. It's probably about the lightest version of Yogacara. I'm showing you the side because it's kind of thin. It's probably about the lightest dose of Yogacara philosophy that you're going to find that's going to make much sense to you. But on the other hand, it's not necessarily easy reading for the casual person who just, wants to have a nice Zen book to stick in their backpack and read on the bus. Although I read it on a lot of buses myself. So there you go. If you like what you heard and want to donate, there's information below for my Patreon and PayPal stuff. Thanks for watching as always. Goodbye.